Wobbly.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Good morning. Rochester Today, Tuesday morning with Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell. Good morning, Tom.
Hi, Andy.
I don't know if you caught the Minnesota Vikings game because I know your Packers game was also on TV at the same time. So you have competing alliances, but the Vikes look pretty good. Surprisingly good.
Okay. Yeah, again.
And I know your Packers pulled off a victory as well.
Yeah.
But I don't even know if I should admit this. A friend has access to online sports betting in another state where it's legal. And as a joke, I put down a $10 bet that the Vikings would win the Super Bowl.
Oh.
Well, I'm a little closer to that. I don't actually think I'm going to collect on that bet, but it's a fun thing to entertain because the odds were pretty long.
Yeah.
What's in the mailbag, Tom?
Well, the Bears are doing a little bit better, too, this year. I think they're split. But mailbag. Branko, satirical cartoonist, shows Kamala talking to a crowd. And now I'm for no tax on tips, and I'm for building the wall, and I'm for fracking. And then behind her, she has, holding her notes, Trump agenda. All those things are there. And Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, says she's changing her mind because times are changing. And Senator Bernie Sanders was a little more honest. He said, she's a pragmatist. She's changing her mind to win the election. In other words, she's lying to win the election, other people would say. This from Rose. Well, I watched the debate. Everything that came out of Kamala's mouth was nasty. And the name Donald Trump, direct attacks on him. No explanation of policy. But she forced Trump to attack her on that, even though Trump was upset by the attacks, which was their strategy. Half the people I asked in my circle did not even watch the debate.
Well, I wish I hadn't. How's that? The more I reflect on that debate, I realize that was more than 90 minutes of my day and time that was wasted. Along those same lines, I read some polling numbers, and some of the questions were phrased as, do you have a more favorable, less favorable view, or the same? Both candidates, Kamala Harris edged Trump as far as a shift in those who have a more favorable view of the candidate. So she made some favorable impressions in the debate. But there's a big caveat to that. Among the respondents to the poll, regardless of their impressions from the debate, it didn't change their minds at all about which direction they were going as far as their votes, which was more or less what I believed after watching it. I didn't see enough to make anybody make a major shift.
Okay. Well, I would think her non-answers and purposeful evasions, would sour people on her. I don't understand.
Yeah, but the expectations were so low on her part that she more or less just didn't have to make any major blunders, and she was going to make a more favorable impression because leading up to it, everybody expected what do you call them? Word salads?
Yeah.
Yeah, and she didn't do that. She managed to be personable.
She has since, though.
Yes, she has.
A very pleasant Pennsylvania local radio man interviewed her, and he got word salads, so she's back in that rut.
Well, the ABC interview that she did over the weekend was just full of slogans and a reiteration of the statements she used during the debate without any real additional substance.
Yeah. From Wayne, members of the House and Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, have said we are being stonewalled in the investigation of Trump's assassination, the first one, by the Secret Service, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security. Why? I think the Secret Service needs to be a standalone agency, and appointees should be not political appointees. I agree the Secret Service should not be political. And then Christopher Wray, FBI director, he's pure politics. He wasn't a cop. They should have police, experienced police leaders in those positions, I think. There's been a second assassination attempt on Trump, and we'll get to that later. But Jerry says, the violence comes from the left, as you've said, Tom. But why is it that only GOP candidates are shot or attacked, not the Dems? An AK-47 is not an accurate long-range firearm. The assassin in this second attempt was 300 to 500 yards away from Trump on the fifth green. The Secret Service shot at him. They spotted the rifle barrel sticking out of a plant and out of the fence, but they didn't hit him. A bystander gave a local sheriff's department the license number of the man that was escaping, and they caught him on a traffic stop. That's the mailbag.
Okay. I would have to say, though, it's a bit inaccurate to say Democrats haven't been the target of these sort of incidents as well. Oh, my goodness. The Arizona senator some years back whose husband was the astronaut, and she was critically wounded in that attack. That one pops into my mind right away. But I would agree that in recent years there have been more attacks on conservative and right Republican candidates than there have Democratic
We're at a
candidates.
baseball field, and then I think attacks of verbal and physical. But it's a sad story.
It is, that's for sure. We'll take that break. Back in a moment with some Minnesota topics with Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell. Rochester Today, News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Welcome back. It's Rochester Today, Tuesday edition. I'm Andy Brownell with Tom Ostrom, and as promised, Tom, Minnesota news. What do you want to start with?
Tim Walz delivered a speech in Wisconsin telling supporters to walk up to other people in the grocery store and have hard conversations to convince them to vote for him. Well, a grocery store, that's the setting of the inflation issue that's bogging people down. And
it's also the last thing anybody wants to deal with while they're grocery shopping.
Yeah.
I find that to be really poor advice by him, because in the current state of political discourse, a lot of people are completely shying away from any discussion of politics. And I can imagine if you run in to buy some eggs or cheese or some milk or whatever it may be, and somebody comes up to you and accosts you about who you're voting for,
sure,
that's probably not going to end well.
Yeah, that's probably going to incur animosity, and prices are up 22% compared to the Trump years in the grocery stores. So Walz says, approach people. Yeah, you bet that could be a confrontation. And then his wife also spoke, and she said, I like Kamala saying, turn the page, turn the page. In other words, forget the past, don't hold me responsible, turn the page. I just added my editorial comment there. And then she imitated Kamala turning a page with her hand motions. And, but that they could say the same thing about Biden and Harris, turn the page, turn the page.
And I know that video of her giving that speech has gotten a lot of views, and it's interesting to me that it's a microcosm of the political state of our country, because approximately half love it and they spread it around and cheer, and then the other half expresses less positive views, let's put it that way, to be polite.
Yes, you bet. A Minnesota citizen who was born in communist China sounded the alarm on Tim Walz. This is from Alpha News. Alan Shen, he's a successful businessman. He talked to Liz Collins on Alpha. He said, Walz's affinity to China, his travels there, they paid for his trips. He taught a class there. he took students there. He reminds me of Trump's cultural, pardon me, what's wrong with me? He reminded me of Mao Zedong's revolution in things that he said and did. I mean, he had a snitch line, and he said his COVID actions and his sympathy to China, which Congress is investigating, by the way, his connections to China. But Mr. Shen said, I see the Democrat Party changing in their message, dividing people, accusing people, prosecuting people, singling out critics. That's what Mao Zedong did during the Cultural Revolution. And the Democrats are trying to erase this country's history and change the history and blot it out. That's what Mao did. He destroyed statues, he burned temples, and that's what you do to control people, wipe out their history, and then they have no bearing, and they have to absorb what you say. And he says the Democrats are doing that too, and left-wingers are knocking down American statues and demeaning the past. And Shen said, you have to erase the identity to control people, and the Democrats are doing that. And he also compared Antifa and Black Lives Matter to the Red Guard during those times and the Cultural Revolution. And they said the Red Guards burned, looted, ransacked, intimidated people. And that's what goes on in this country. And he questioned Waltz's trips to China, what happened there. He thinks Waltz is a Maoist. And he said, I was a patriot and used to vote for Democrat candidates, but things are changing, and even he says I'm no longer a Democrat.
As far as the criticisms of the governor are concerned, strategically, as far as a election year strategy, I don't think the China accusations against Walz are going to lead to anybody changing their opinions about him. In fact, I think there might be backlash if it's pushed too far. Back in the 90s, there was quite a bit of optimism about potentially diffusing China as a threat. Obviously, that optimism has evaporated, and the warnings about the communist China threat have ended up being quite ominously true in many cases. But in those days in the early 90s, when the University of Minnesota was setting up a satellite campus in China, and there was many school districts offering Mandarin as an elective course, the language, I just think that I'm not offering excuses for whatever Walz did, but I think there's enough people who were growing up during that time who would be sympathetic to Walz and his ventures in China, because they might have also been overseas doing those sort of things or had business ties with the Chinese at that time. There was a lot of business ties in Rochester between IBM and China at that time as well.
Yeah. Well, China is certainly shown to be our adversary, but corporations don't seem to care, and others don't. Walz also is emulating the presidential aspirant that he's running with at the Minnesota State Fair. He was eating an ice cream cone like Joey does, and a reporter walked up to him and said, "What do you think about the hostages found dead in Gaza?" And Tim, who's done it other times, just looked at him and walked away without answering. That's what Kamala does, and Walz is playing that act too, and avoid the press and attack Trump.
Well, speaking from experience, Tim Walz, even from his days in Congress, routinely either ignored or denied requests for interviews from this radio station and the news department tied to this radio station, even when running for election, when offered opportunities for airtime to be interviewed. about his campaigns flatly refused to do it. So I don't know if that is because he anticipated perhaps being asked some less than softball questions, or I'm not gonna speculate, but it was very disappointing.
Yeah, and one more Minnesota item. The Walz administration is being sued for withholding records on the George Floyd riot response. He handled the protests and riots that erupted or didn't in the wake of George Floyd's death. A state commission report had critical reviews. The data thereafter is under lock and key as to what was said, what did he say to officials, what did they do and plan. And it's a driving issue. The public record media as a group, and it's got a suit against the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, and it's being stonewalled. And to get materials, what did the political leaders say? What was their strategy? What was their analysis? They're keeping information. The lawsuit centers on the Amherst H. Wilder Foundation, which was hired to assess the state's handling of riots. And they want to interview people at different levels and get the documents, get the data. And one spokesperson said, we put in a request to the Department of Public Safety because they own that material. They should have it, but they don't respond to us. They won't help us find out this information. Where's the material? And no response. And defendants have failed to perform their duties, evidently, and they imposed law without limitation and handled the data and their conversations with each other behind the scenes. We have a right to have access to, but the documents won't be released to us.
That is the issue, I think, that could prove effective if I were a Republican campaign strategist. I would stick to the George Floyd riots of 2020 and the Walz administration's response to the COVID pandemic. Walz and officials surrounding him and his administration have been fairly dismissive of criticisms concerning the rioting that occurred in Minneapolis and the ongoing aftermaths of those riots, the burned up buildings and the economic impact. And also the same line of thinking goes with the COVID response as well. And I understand the argument. We didn't know what we didn't know at the time, and they were reacting with extreme caution, but there was also some misleading statements made by his administration concerning the modeling that they used, the supposed sophisticated modeling put together by the best of the best at the University of Minnesota Infectious Disease, which was later determined to not be exactly truthful. It was more or less slapped together by some graduate students and put forward, and it was horribly inaccurate. And we're still feeling the aftershocks of that today, particularly in our school systems. Mm-hmm. You've got kids who missed out on months, if not years, of educational opportunities and may not ever get them back. Absenteeism is still a problem. Look at our test scores. And also the other one, if I were running a campaign, I would be all over the place on the COVID fraud-related issues, the feeding our future business, and the role of the Minnesota Department of Education in that, not the China thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right.
Well,
we should probably take a break for news.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say I think the China thing's important because they're a belligerent ally undercutting the United States, spying on us, buying property. They even have spy systems on the cranes at seaports attached to the cranes. They're an adversary, and the less respect they have for our government, like Biden, and Kamala, the more dangerous they are and what they might do overseas.
All right, Tom. We'll take our break for news and come back. We have lots more to talk about. Obviously, the events over the weekend in Florida on the top of the list. Tom Ostrom's here. I'm Andy Brownell, Rochester Today at News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96
FM.
Good morning. Welcome back, Rochester Today. I'm Andy Brownell with my friend Tom Ostrom. It's Tuesday, and once again, Tom, here we are talking about an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, thankfully thwarted by the Secret Service. Another bizarre scenario that took place, and a lot of unanswered questions as to the person responsible, and their motivations. But it also points to, I think, the obvious need for, I think it was the Wall Street Journal said that given the atmosphere, the political atmosphere in this country right now, the candidates running for office, and that would include Harris and include, obviously, Trump, considering what's already happened to him, should be receiving the level of protection that President Biden is receiving at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Because the threat is more than obvious. It's already happened.
It occurred on the golf course that Trump owns in Florida. The killer is Ryan Wesley, or the attempted assassinate is Ryan Wesley Routh, who was arrested years ago for having a machine gun. But how did he know Trump's schedule? How did he know where Trump would be? It was several hundred yards away. A Secret Service agent saw a rifle barrel sticking out of a fence, and then approached and saw someone running and shot at him and missed. A bystander watched all this and photographed the culprit's license number, and the sheriff's department caught up with him, pulled him over for a traffic offense, but then arrested him knowing who he was. And he was, the Washington swamp was cavalier about it. And some Rachel Vindman. The Vindman brothers were in the military, and they initiated the impeachment hearings on Trump because they overheard a phone call. He was checking into Ukraine corruption, and the impeachment business occurred in Congress because of them. And the wife of one of the Vindmans laughed about this and said, well, all the ears are safe. Nobody was hurt. All ears are safe from harm. And even said that Trump brought this on himself, too.
Yeah, and that's really helpful rhetoric, right? Being sarcastic, obviously, when I say that. You can't help but to draw the connection between the level of hyperbole used by the Democrats in this campaign, beginning with Biden, going to Harris, going to even at the local level, some elected officials here in the Rochester area, when speaking about the presidential election, to essentially say he is, I'm talking about Trump, that if he is reelected, he is going to destroy the country. That he is a dictator in waiting who is going to end our democratic experiment in the United States of America, totally ignoring that he was president for 4 years. And that didn't happen. Although they used January 6th as the basis for arguing that was, basically an attempted coup, and therefore defines Trump and everything to do with Trump, and therefore he is an existential threat. When the president of the United States is saying that about somebody, granted, 95% of Americans or more will take that as the same old useless political rhetoric that it is. But there are enough people out there, apparently, because we're seeing the actions of them, who take those words to heart and act on them. And once again, I'll say I wish everybody involved in politics would tone it down, but I don't think they will. And obviously the statement by the man's wife points to the mindset that we're dealing with here when we're talking about people running for office in the most successful and free nation in the world. Although the freedom part could be argued nowadays, but you got to be careful and to throw those kind of statements around for trying to come up with the correct word here. I'm being a bit jaded. To win elections and put a target on somebody's back, and I don't care if it's coming from the right or the left. Anybody doing this should stop doing it. Yeah.
Well, I think the Secret Service should pay a visit to the Vindmans. Nicholas Baez, a spokesman for the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office, was in a bar, and he was talking to a stranger, a woman, and he didn't know he was being secretly recorded by that woman. And he said that District Attorney Bragg in Trump's prosecution is absolute nonsense. It's unprofessional. It's nonsense. He said, I've known Bragg for 15 years. This is unprecedented, this hush money case against Trump. And it's a headline prosecutor that wants other things. He wants to be something else. He wants to be mayor. And he's changing the evidence to fit the case. And then he said, I think the prosecutors are going to try to lock Trump up, and that's going to be ugly. And he criticized Manhattan Supreme Court Judge Juan Merchan, and he said they're obsessed with getting Trump. And then later, his statements were leaked to the press, and he was surprised, and then he apologized. He said, I respect everybody in our office.
Mm-hmm. Careful who you talk to, apparently.
Yeah, right. But Trump, and then I think Trump should pardon most of the January 6 people that have been incarcerated, because most of them were peaceful. And the government's even prosecuted some old ladies that demonstrated outside an abortion clinic. They're in prison. And Trump said, I'm going to do some pardons when I'm in office. And then this will get his opponents alarmed. He said, when I win, the cheaters in the election will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. We're going to overhaul and end this election fraud. He didn't mince words on that. So there he's uttered some threats that his enemies will make use of.
This is kind of on a related topic. I'm trying to get to it as best I can. I read a pretty good opinion piece over the weekend regarding the U.S. Supreme Court and a New York Times article that came out that represents another leak from the Supreme Court, this time perhaps a justice on the Supreme Court, pertaining to comments made by the Supreme Court Chief Justice Roberts, and some of it being personal conversations that the Times, that'd be the New York Times, was using purportedly, I guess, to support the argument for reforms to the Supreme Court, whether it be enforceable ethics or term limits or whatever it may be that is being pushed by Schumer and others in Congress. And it was, I thought, a well-written piece that used it as an example of, while acknowledging Trump's shortcomings and some of his statements that have allowed the argument to move forward that he sees himself as a strong man, instead of a public servant, that the Democrats are pushing their own anti-democracy agenda where they're push it to illegitimize the current U.S. Supreme Court because of these cases where it is ruled against their interests. And, part of it is the criminal prosecutions of Donald Trump and the victories that the Robert Court has given Trump in those cases, which are not blanket victories, to say the least, but have certainly hampered the prosecution of him by these handful of prosecutors in these New York and Georgia and Florida. So it's a good piece if you want to read it. It draws some pretty good, in my view, some pretty good conclusions.
Yes, sounds like it. Caroline Glick, talking to Newsmax, a significant number of Jews will vote Republican this time because of the anti-Semitism that's erupted in the Democrat Party and on college campuses. And who is Caroline Glick? She's a former advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. And now she's a senior editor for a Jewish news syndicate. And she has contact with American Jewish leaders. And she said, you'll find for the first time President Trump will get over 50% of the Jewish vote. That's an earthquake.
That would be an earthquake.
And according to an American Jewish Committee poll, 57% of American Jews, more than half, feel more committed to Israel after the Hamas attacks than before. And Glick said, you can say that 30% of American Jews who tend conservative or moderate are more likely to vote for a Republican, but it's also 27% of the Jews that vote Democrat. And if that changes, that's a significant event in the election because they are starting to look at the extent of dangerous anti-Semitism in America.
And another aspect of that you didn't bring up, and I don't know if former Israeli official, now journalist or publisher, brought up, just less enthusiasm among liberal U.S. Jewish voters for Democratic candidates could be a boon for Donald Trump, because if they don't vote in November saying, look, I'm not going to vote for Trump, but I'm also not going to vote for Kamala Harris and the Biden administration, their non-participation would be a big boost for Trump's campaign as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Trump was very supportive of Israel during his presidency and moved the capital where Israel preferred from Tel Aviv. And retired Harvard law professor Dershowitz, he said, I'm quitting the Democrat Party. They left me, now I'm leaving them. Why? Anti-Semitism. It's destructive, it's dangerous. And he pointed out people like Keith Ellison and Sharpton and others are openly anti-Semitic. He said, I've been a Democrat for 60 years, no longer. And I also supported President Donald Trump, he said, against the legal charges. He defended Trump during the impeachment and did a good job. And he just said, also, I'm upset by Vice President Harris not attending Netanyahu's address to Congress. And he said, I've just had it.
All right, Tom, we'll take our break. Come back in a moment. More of Rochester Today, Tuesday edition on News Talk 1340 KROC AM.
Probably. Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Good morning. We have a few minutes left. It's Rochester Today. Tom Ostrom's here. I'm Andy Brownell, and this is where we try to cover some international news. What do you want to talk about, Tom?
Russian leaders are furious. NATO members met in Europe, and the United States and Britain, are thinking of sending more weaponry to the Ukraine, and the Ukraine intends to use it more in Russia. The United States still wants them to limit their use of such weapons. But Putin said, we have nuclear weapons. We will not tolerate our destruction. And if these missiles are used to go deeper into Russia and threaten us, we will destroy Kiev. We will send all of our drones, all of our weaponry to destroy that capital. So I think we're stepping closer to World War III by these machinations. And Russia is also attacking the Ukraine invaders in the Russian Kursk region, and they've redirected troops from the Donetsk region in the Ukraine, but they're being very successful in the Ukraine. And with winter coming, that doesn't bode well. But Secretary of State Blinken was in Europe, and he's catering to the Ukrainians and giving them more weapons. And a Polish member of the European Parliament, not the Polish Parliament, but the European Parliament, slammed Secretary Blinken after Blinken's meeting with officials, including Polish officials. And he slammed the Secretary of State. He said, "You're leading us to World War III. Go home, get out of Europe, get lost. We're not going to have Polish citizens die in your Ukraine war."
Going back to the missile business, one aspect of that doesn't get talked about a lot is our stockpiles of these long-range, highly accurate missiles has already been depleted by these conflicts. And we're having a hard time, being the United States and NATO, catching up on production of these weapons, which would be crucial if things between the United States and China got hot. And the missiles that have been sent to Ukraine have been used effectively in attacks on Crimea. And I know that's kind of the argument by some. Well, look what they did in Crimea. It forced the Russian Navy to pull out of their naval base in Crimea, which has made Ukraine safer and their shipments of their exports safer. But I would argue that's quite a bit different than actually lobbing American-made missiles into Russia.
Right. Sweden has one of the highest gun death rates in Europe from the migrants and explosives, hand grenade use, everything else. And now they've changed their mind about immigration. They've closed their border to future and further migrants and asylum seekers, and they've started deporting some. They said this has got to stop, and some of this violence is bleeding too over into Denmark, and so Europeans are getting concerned about their open borders too.
Okay, Tom. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. So until Thursday morning, I bid you a fond adieu.
Okay.
All right. You have a great next couple of days, and we'll chat with you soon and have a little bit more to talk about, I'm sure. We'll learn a little bit more about this assassination attempt, hopefully by Thursday as well. I say hopefully because we're still waiting for answers concerning what happened in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. All right, he's Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell, Rochester Today on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.